A man hears a voice in the darkness. No one is standing beside him. The voice calls his name. It warns him, commands him. Sometimes it tells him something he could not possibly know. And the strangest part is not that he hears it. The strangest part is that, for most of human history, nobody would have immediately asked whether the voice was coming from his own mind. They might have asked a completely different question. Who is speaking? For an ancient person, an unexplained voice was not necessarily evidence that something was wrong inside the skull. It could be a god, a dead ancestor, a demon, a spirit, a curse, a warning, or something that had deliberately crossed the boundary between the human world and everything beyond it. And that creates a disturbing possibility. What if ancient humans were not trying to explain voices incorrectly? What if they were using the only explanations their world gave them? For thousands of years, people heard voices without seeing anyone speak. But the way they understood those voices depended on one enormous assumption. Where does a thought end and another being begin? We tend to assume that hearing a voice without a visible speaker is a medical mystery, but that assumption is surprisingly recent. To understand what ancient people thought was happening, we have to step into a world where gods were not distant characters from mythology. They were possible causes of everyday events. A failed harvest could have a divine explanation. A strange illness could have a spiritual explanation. A terrifying dream could be a message. And a voice appearing from nowhere, that could be a conversation. In ancient Mesopotamia, people lived in a world crowded with invisible forces. Their written records describe gods, demons, ghosts, omens, dreams, and supernatural encounters. Some illnesses were understood through both physical and supernatural causes. A person might seek a healer, but that healer could also perform rituals intended to drive away a harmful being. The important thing is that these explanations did not necessarily contradict each other. A physical symptom could have a spiritual cause. A voice could be treated as an event happening to the person rather than something produced by the person. And this pattern appears again and again across ancient cultures. The Greeks had a particularly strange example. Socrates described something he called his daimonion. It was not simply a voice giving him detailed instructions. He described an inner divine sign that would sometimes stop him from doing something. It was experienced as a warning, and Socrates did not necessarily interpret this as madness. He interpreted it as something meaningful. That is the part that becomes uncomfortable. The same experience can be described in radically different ways depending on the world surrounding the person. One person hears a voice and thinks, "Something is wrong with me." Another hears a voice and thinks, "Something is trying to tell me something." The sound may be similar. The meaning is completely different. And then the ancient world gets stranger, because sometimes the voice was not considered a problem at all. It could be considered evidence that someone was special. Prophets claimed to receive divine messages. Oracles entered altered states and delivered revelations. Religious figures described communication with gods or spirits. The boundary between revelation and illness was not a simple line. In fact, ancient societies sometimes built entire institutions around people claiming to receive messages from invisible beings. That creates a problem for the modern explanation. If hearing a voice is always treated as evidence of disorder, what do we do with cultures that deliberately valued certain forms of voice hearing? And what happens when the same experience can produce either fear or status depending on the interpretation? But it gets stranger. Ancient people did not all believe every unexplained voice came from a god. Some traditions contain much darker possibilities. The Greeks and Romans had concepts of spirits, ghosts, and beings that could interfere with human lives. The Roman world, for example, contained a complicated landscape of gods, household spirits, ancestors, omens, curses, and supernatural forces. A person could encounter something invisible without immediately assuming it was imaginary. The question was not simply whether the experience was real. The question was what kind of being caused it, and that distinction mattered. A helpful voice might be treated as guidance. A threatening voice might be treated as an attack. A voice connected to a dead relative might be interpreted as contact with the dead. The experience could remain the same while the identity of the speaker changed. Then researchers looking back at ancient societies discovered another complication. Ancient descriptions of unusual mental experiences do not fit neatly into modern medical categories. People experience dreams, visions, trances, seizures, grief experiences, religious ecstasy, sleep paralysis, and voice-like experiences. Today, we separate many of these experiences into different categories. Ancient people often did not. To them, the important distinction might have been whether the experience brought a message, caused danger, revealed knowledge, or violated the expected order of the world. And that means one modern label can hide an enormous amount of human experience. Someone hearing a voice during grief might not interpret it the same way as someone hearing threatening voices every day. A prophet receiving a religious revelation was not necessarily describing the same experience as someone overwhelmed by frightening voices. The ancient world did not have our diagnostic vocabulary. But that does not mean ancient people were incapable of noticing patterns. They watched what happened. They recorded omens. They remembered dreams. They developed rituals. They created explanations. And sometimes, they tried to determine whether a voice was trustworthy. That may be the most surprising part. Ancient humans were not simply gullible. They could be deeply skeptical. A voice claiming to be divine did not automatically become divine. Religious traditions often contained tests, warnings about deception, competing revelations, and stories about people being misled by supernatural forces. The ancient question could therefore become, if a voice speaks to you, how do you know who it is? And that question sounds remarkably modern, because today, we face a different version of the same problem. We have neurological explanations, psychological explanations, medical diagnoses. We can examine the brain, we can study perception, we can investigate how stress, trauma, sleep, medication, illness, grief, and other factors can affect the way people experience voices. But having a scientific explanation does not automatically tell us what the experience means to the person experiencing it. And this is where ancient history suddenly becomes personal. You have probably experienced something stranger than you remember. A voice in a dream that felt completely real. Your name being called when nobody called it. A sound in another room that turned out to be nothing. The sensation that someone was standing nearby when nobody was there. The brain is constantly trying to determine whether signals come from outside or inside. Most of the time it gets the answer right. But the fact that the boundary can blur tells us something important. The human mind does not simply record reality. It interprets it. It is constantly asking, who caused this? And when the answer is unclear, the mind searches for one. An ancient person might say, a spirit spoke. A medieval person might say, a demon spoke. A modern person might say, my brain generated a voice. Each explanation changes the meaning of the experience. But none of them changes the basic mystery. There is a voice, there is a listener, and somewhere between them is the human mind trying to decide what just happened. This is why the history of voice hearing is more unsettling than a simple story about ancient superstition. Because ancient humans may have been asking a question that we still have not completely solved. When something appears inside your experience, how do you know where it came from? We trust our senses because we have to. You trust the sound of your own name. You trust the voice of someone you recognize. You trust the difference between your thoughts and the world outside them. But your brain has to construct that distinction. It does not come with a perfect label saying, this thought is yours. This sound came from outside. Most of the time, the system works so smoothly that you never notice it. Then something unusual happens. A voice appears. A presence is felt. A familiar person seems to speak when they are not there. And suddenly, the invisible machinery becomes visible. The ancient person looked outward and asked which spirit had entered the room. The modern person looks inward and asks what happened inside the brain. But both are standing before the same strange phenomenon. Something was experienced as a voice. Something felt separate from the self, and the human mind demanded an explanation. Perhaps that is why ancient stories of gods, demons, ancestors, and spirits are filled with voices. They were not only stories about supernatural beings, they were attempts to explain one of the strangest things a human being can experience. A thought that does not feel like a thought. And perhaps the most unsettling question is not whether ancient people were right or wrong about the voices they heard. It is this. When you hear the voice inside your own head, how certain are you that you know who is speaking?